I believe we can have peace with honor, reasonable security with national solvency.
What if I told you that the man who saved democracy in World War II once came within hours of being court-martialed and kicked out of the army? That the supreme Allied commander who orchestrated D-Day learned his most crucial leadership lessons not on any battlefield, but in the sweltering jungles of Panama, reading military philosophy under a mentor who would transform him from a failing officer into the architect of Allied victory? This is the untold story of Dwight Eisenhower. Not the five-star general you think you know, but the struggling young officer who nearly destroyed his career before it began, only to become the most successful coalition commander in human history. June 1918, a 28-year-old lieutenant colonel stands in the fields of Gettysburg, where 55 years earlier, the fate of America hung in the balance during Pickett's charge. But Eisenhower isn't there to commemorate the past. He's there to build the future of warfare. He's been handed an impossible mission: create America's first tank training facility with no tanks, no procedures, and no precedent. The irony is staggering. The man who would later command the largest mechanized invasion in history was learning to improvise with machine guns mounted on flatbed trucks because the Army couldn't deliver a single tank to his training camp. When the first actual tank, a French Renault FT, finally arrived in June 1918, Eisenhower had already trained thousands of men using nothing but ingenuity and determination. But here's what makes this story truly extraordinary. This wasn't just about tanks. This was about a young officer learning that leadership isn't about having perfect resources. It's about achieving the impossible with whatever you have. When the Spanish flu pandemic struck his camp in September 1918, killing 175 of his 10,000 men, Eisenhower's rapid response and hygiene measures contained the outbreak more effectively than most military installations of the time. Yet despite this success, Eisenhower felt like a failure. While his West Point classmates were earning glory in the trenches of France, he was stuck stateside, never seeing combat, watching what he thought was his chance for military distinction slip away forever. He had no idea that this disappointment was actually preparing him for something far greater than any individual battlefield heroics. The real transformation began 4 years later in 1922 in the most unlikely place imaginable, Panama. Eisenhower had been assigned as executive officer under General Fox Connor, and he was miserable. Panama was considered a career dead end, a place where ambitious officers went to fade into obscurity. Eisenhower arrived expecting to serve his time and move on. Instead, he encountered a mentor who would change the course of history. Fox Connor had served as Pershing's chief of operations during World War I, and he saw something in the frustrated young officer that Eisenhower couldn't see in himself. In the humid evenings of the Canal Zone, Connor began Eisenhower's real education. They studied Clausewitz's On War together, dissecting the political dimensions of military operations. Connor taught him that future wars would be fought not by individual nations, but by coalitions, and that the general who could hold those coalitions together would determine the fate of civilization. The outstanding soldier of my time, Eisenhower would later call Connor, the one more or less invisible figure to whom I owe an incalculable debt. This wasn't just mentorship. This was the forging of the strategic mind that would later coordinate British, American, Canadian, and Free French forces in the most complex military operation ever attempted. But Connor taught him something even more crucial, that military genius isn't about tactical brilliance. It's about understanding that war is ultimately a political endeavor. Every decision, every operation, every alliance must serve not just military objectives, but the larger goal of creating a sustainable peace. This lesson would prove prophetic. When Roosevelt faced the most important military decision of World War II, choosing between George Marshall and Dwight Eisenhower to command Operation Overlord, he chose Eisenhower precisely because of these skills Connor had helped develop. Marshall was the better strategist, Patton was the more aggressive tactician, but Eisenhower was the only American general who could hold together the fractious alliance that would liberate Europe. The D-Day invasion wasn't just the largest amphibious assault in history, it was the ultimate test of everything Eisenhower had learned about coalition warfare. British generals who had been fighting for 5 years had to take orders from an American who had never commanded troops in combat. French resistance fighters had to coordinate with Allied intelligence. Soviet forces had to time their Eastern Front offensive to support the Western invasion. One personality conflict, one diplomatic misstep, one failure of coordination could have doomed the entire operation. But Eisenhower had been preparing for this moment since those evenings in Panama, studying how to balance competing national interests while maintaining focus on the ultimate objective. His success wasn't measured in tactical victories. It was measured in his ability to keep Churchill, de Gaulle, Montgomery, and Patton working toward the same goal, despite their fundamental disagreements about strategy, politics, and national pride. The most remarkable part, this was just the beginning. After achieving the greatest military victory in American history, Eisenhower faced an even greater challenge: building the peace. As military governor of occupied Germany, he had to transform a defeated enemy into a democratic ally. As NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander, he had to create an entirely new type of international military organization from scratch. His insistence on appointing a separate four-star deputy to command U.S. forces in Europe, rather than dual-hatting the NATO position, showed the same coalition-building wisdom he had learned in Panama decades earlier. He understood that NATO's credibility depended on being seen as a truly multinational organization, not an American-dominated alliance. This is why Eisenhower's story matters today. In our age of global challenges, from climate change to cyber warfare to pandemic response, the lessons he learned about building and maintaining international coalitions are more relevant than ever. His career demonstrates that the most effective leaders aren't those who dominate through force, but those who achieve objectives by building consensus among diverse stakeholders with competing interests. The young officer who nearly washed out of the Army became the general who saved democracy not through individual heroics, but by mastering the art of turning potential enemies into allies, competitors into collaborators, and national rivalries into shared purpose. From the improvised tank training at Gettysburg to the jungles of Panama, from the beaches of Normandy to the founding of NATO, Eisenhower's career reveals a profound truth. The greatest victories aren't won by the strongest generals, but by the wisest coalition builders. In a world that increasingly requires international cooperation to solve existential challenges, perhaps we need more leaders who understand what Fox Connor taught that young officer in Panama so many years ago: that the future belongs not to those who can win wars, but to those who can build the alliances that prevent them. The man who saved the world wasn't a warrior, he was a diplomat in uniform, and that made all the difference.